You're listening to the Wellness Evolution Community Podcast. I'm Dr. Christine Smith, and this is where your body becomes something you understand again, because symptoms aren't failures. They're your body's most honest attempt to protect you. Each episode, we decode those patterns with root cause physiology, nervous system insight, and metaphors that make your biology feel alive, understandable, and trustworthy. You are smart. Your body is designed to heal. Let's remember how together. What if the discomfort you feel right now isn't a sign something's wrong, but a sign your nervous system no longer needs the person that you've been? We tend to interpret discomfort as failure, regression, danger, but there's a phase of healing where the body stabilizes and the mind hasn't always caught up yet. The old strategies still fire, but they're no longer needed. That mismatch can feel unsettling, disorienting, in a whole host of different ways. So the question really is, why does healing sometimes feel like losing yourself rather than finding yourself? And today I have a fantastic guest for you to help us dive into those questions. Dr. Lance Cutsforth. He has a doctorate in functional medicine, a doctorate of divinity, and he used to be in special forces and then had a degree in psychology and aeronautical engineering, and then went back in as an infantry officer and now runs an entire program called Mansana, which I believe you said translates from Latin to the mountain where I go to heal. Mm-hmm. And it's a place of safety, love, and community where he helps bring people of all different backgrounds, but especially those who have been high performing and their nervous systems have been through a lot, to come into this space and really start to find themselves again, because survival can sometimes turn into a personality. And so I think we wanted to talk a little bit about how to get people out of this. So Dr. Lance, I'd love if you could share anything that you want people to know about you as we kind of dive into this question of, like, when you work with people, how often do you see survival functioning as an identity for them?
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and this chance for us to drop in and collaborate and talk about best practices that will ultimately benefit. Hopefully, there are nuggets that all of your listeners will be able to draw from. As far as how often do we see those survival traits end up as major personality markers for the populations that we work with, almost 100% of the time. Yeah. Those adaptive behaviors that are assimilated during formative years end up propelling us forward out of those things that we perceive as threat. And many times when we're younger, there's a reward cycle, a doingness that's required versus a beingness. And then the doingness very much becomes the identity. If we look at things through an internal family systems lens, we build strong protectors and firefighters to help protect and shield what Dick Schwartz calls the exiles. I like to call them the wounded little ones.
Mm. I had someone call them the loyal soldiers once, and I liked that too.
I like that a lot.
Yeah.
So ultimately, there's a patterning that helps us survive. And then there comes a point where we need to move out of survival and into thrival, if we want to rhyme the words. And so for a lot of people, that happens around 40. Carl Jung said, life begins at 40. Until then, we're simply gathering data. If you look at David Brooks' concept of the two mountains, we spend the first half of our life climbing the mountain of worldly achievement, everything that we're programmed to believe will bring us the relief, the happiness. We climb that first mountain expecting there to be the pot of gold and the silver palace and unicorns and kittens and all of those things. And we get to the top of that first mountain, and most times we find desolation and tumbleweeds and bones, and we feel very betrayed by the world in many cases. And those that told us, well, just do this and you'll find happiness. And we get to that place and we don't find the happiness. But if we can slow down, if we can sit down and sit in that space and cast our gaze out a little further, we'll see the mountain range. And from there, we can look out and see our second mountain, which is our mountain of purpose, what some would call our dharma. So we fight karma the first half of our life to find our dharma, which is our calling the second half.
Oh, I like that. We fight karma to find our dharma.
Yeah.
I think that's very accurate. Thank you you have a way of describing things in the most beautiful, metaphorical, kind of picturesque ways. And I really appreciate that. I think it makes it really accessible to everyone, no matter where you are in your journey, because ultimately we all go through these things at some point in some way, maybe to different levels, depending on what's going on in your life or how you interpreted what was going on in your life, because it's all about our perception of what's happening. But I find what you're talking about, how it's like these traits are found in most people, but especially the population that you work with. What do you see as the most common survival traits that people mistake, thinking that that's who they are?
Hypervigilance is there. Performance and achievement for validation is typically there as well. The willingness to take on seemingly overwhelming tasks to be able to accomplish those, and so the identity of accomplishment. What have I done? What was my rank? What awards did I achieve? What deployments did I go on? In some, how many degrees are on the wall behind me? As I sit at my desk, how many awards are out there? And those are great milestones. Those are great markers. But when those things become the identity, then that's where there's a disparity within what I'll call the soul, because things don't quite fit, and it works until it doesn't. And then when we find that, and these are stages of what Joseph Campbell called the hero's journey. And so many people will go and they'll achieve and they'll work. And so again, climbing that first mountain, and then something glitches and it seems like, okay, there needs to be more here. If we look at The Matrix, if you remember that movie, there was a call, and in The Matrix, it was a literal call to Neo from Morpheus, because Neo was noticing that things were not quite right. And then so if you follow the trajectory of the hero's journey, there's the call, then there's the refusal of the call. And many people, that's where it ends. And they end up being what Theodore Roosevelt called, in The Man in the Arena, those poor and timid souls that know neither victory nor defeat, but those that answer the call. Then when the call is answered, then there's the arrival of the mentors. There's the assembly of the campaigning group or the party. There's the climbing of the mountain, going through the ordeals, coming to the cave, what Plato coined as the cave of shadows, and going into the cave and facing the dragon or the demon, and either fighting it or dancing with it, but coming to some sort of resolution with it, what Jung described as shadow work, and exploring that and coming face to face with it and finding resolution. So in that point, there is a death of perceived self and the resurrection of true self, the finding of the treasure, and then returning back into our existence to bring that treasure forward. Not from an egotistical savior standpoint, but more as being a mentor or peer for the next generation facing their challenges. And there's not just one mountain and not one cave. This is call it an upward escalating helix because with each level of awareness comes more opportunity to continue that path.
I always liked the idea that life is like a staircase, like a spiral staircase, and you just kind of keep going around it, seeing the same things from a slightly different angle.
Mm-hmm.
And they often say, like, life keeps giving you the same lesson over and over until you learn it.
Yeah.
And
that's the karma part.
yeah, right. Totally. I'm so curious with these populations that you've worked with and like in your own journey, like what have you seen that scares people about letting those identities go and where that like shadow struggle is in that?
In most cases, it's fear of vulnerability. Worked with a lot of folks that would have no problem, have had no problem engaging with a combatant, navigating through bullets, dealing with the quote hard, scary stuff, but ask for vulnerability, ask to, okay, so what's really going on inside? And that scares the hell out of them. And scared the hell out of me too, from personal experience. Just coming face to face with those things, the things that are casting the shadows, and we see the shadows for so long, and we believe that those are the case. And it brings me back to when I was a kid and would watch Tom and Jerry cartoons. And there's a particular cartoon that I remember where Tom the cat saw these big scary shadows on the wall, and he got scared and took off. And then the camera pans over, and there's Jerry the little mouse standing in front of a flashlight making shadow monsters. And in most cases that ends up being the reality. When people are actually able to turn and face the thing casting the shadow, it's never as scary as the shadow itself. And that goes back into, so then if we look at brain function, if we look at this from different lenses, the shadows are created by the amygdala, because the amygdala is our baseline, our reptilian brain, and lots of parts of the brain. We'll just look at the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. And so the amygdala is the place where the default mode network, the survival instinct, the subconscious, they're all synonyms for the same thing, which
it's that
is
filter of what's safe or not.
Right. And so our amygdala navigates us forward by looking in a rear view mirror. What have I done to get here? I'm going to keep doing that. The amygdala doesn't have strategic planning, doesn't have moral scales, it doesn't have imagination. It has, what have I done to get here? We're going to keep doing that. And so if there is a pattern of chaos, well, then the amygdala will crave chaos, because the amygdala doesn't have moral scales. It just looks as same, not same. And anything that is not same will be fought against to bring things back into same. So if the pattern created is a baseline of chaos, the amygdala will crave chaos. And if there is calmness or safety, the amygdala views that as threat, as counterintuitive as that sounds. And so then if the amygdala can't find chaos, it will hijack the imagination. It'll hijack the prefrontal cortex to create story, to be able to bring itself back into a place of comfort. So the reptilian brain will choose known misery over unknown bliss every time if given the opportunity. And the challenge is that controls 90% of our behaviors in any given day. The prefrontal cortex, where the conscious mind lives, only controls 10%. And until we understand how to use the prefrontal cortex to reprogram the amygdala, we will have these internal struggles. And that's where things like, well, I should, and I need to, and I want to, and oh my gosh, I've failed morally because I've slid back into these old patterns, these survival patterns. And when we can recognize it's not a moral failure, it's not a lack of determination, it's not a lack of motivation, it's a lack of understanding how that reprogramming works. If you're trying to push on a door that opens in, it's going to be really difficult to get through it. So we need to learn the mechanism and how that can reprogram, and also be able to remove the shame and guilt around the adaptive behaviors, or around the things that those adaptive behaviors are trying to protect, and move into acceptance, move into forgiveness, and then from there, move out of doingness and move more into beingness, to quote Hawkins.
I think that's such a good way to say things. And as you were talking, I was just kind of thinking about the amygdala and its role, and how you're discussing, like, until we can learn how to control it from our cognitive mind, we can only go so far. And I help people all the time kind of learn how to reprogram the different layers of their brain, because there are layers, and our cognitive brain and our amygdala work in very different layers. So it would kind of be like, a good metaphor would be like writing in a Word document on your computer how you want the computer to work, or pulling up the black box that programs the computer and typing in code of how you want the computer to work.
Mm-hmm.
The Word document's kind of like the cognitive thinking, like you can think about it all you want, but it's not going to access the programming. The amygdala, to access that programming, usually has to involve something within that region of the brain. So you're also processing other limbic emotions, meaning like the emotional center of the brain, or you're working with the brain stem in some way, and how you're actually interpreting data from the environment to see if you're safe or not. And that's, how concepts like EMDR work, is they use like amygdala rocking, where it's like you're going from side to side with things. And there's a lot of different approaches and tools for accessing these things. And I think a lot of different techniques have these tools, but I'd love to also dive into what you view shadow work to be. I actually think that term is new for a number of people, and I think people have different ideas of what it is. I've always kind of explained it to people as the parts of you that you feel so incongruent with that you can't even see that they're there. So it's like, oh, I would never do that. And so therefore there's no possible way I could be doing that in my life. But it's because you're in some kind of adaptive mechanism that's keeping you safe, which is your body and your brain just doing their job. But now we are highly conscious enough creatures that we can bring awareness to these things, and we can start to shift them. And I'm really glad that you brought up the component of, like, some people are afraid of their shadow work, or there's like a shame or a guilt component. And I just want to like wipe that away for everybody right now. Every single human on the planet goes through these emotions. Every single human on the planet deals with this stuff throughout various phases in their life. It's not like you do it once and you're just done. It's basically this recurring thing that comes up that you're always reviewing. And they say the highest form of intelligence is the ability to observe your own thinking patterns. So essentially metacognition. So when you can realize, oh, like I'm feeling agitated right now, rather than just being in and of your agitation with no other concept of what's going on, it's a very different state to work with things from. So I'm so curious how you would describe this kind of shadow work to people, because I think a lot of people might think of it as like backsliding in their healing, because maybe they're not feeling great, but actually it can be a launch forward.
I really appreciate how you laid all of that out. And so from my lens, shadow work is simply looking to understand parts of us that are misunderstood, rather than pushing them to the side and pretending that they don't exist. That, again, that works until it doesn't. So the shadow work is really more approaching those parts of us that we've been conditioned to believe are less than optimal, approaching them with curiosity and with kindness. Many times the quote shadows and those scary parts inside of us are simply internal defense mechanisms that were put in place because we didn't have the tools and the resourcing to deal with events, or what we'll call traumas. Our definition of trauma is a situation with which we are faced, for which we are not adequately prepared or resourced. Very simple.
I often say a state where you feel helpless.
Yeah. And for example, firefighters that we work with, if they roll up to a structure fire and they've got their pumper truck and they've got their their fireproof gear, and they've got their recirculating respirators, and they've got training, they can deal with that structure fire very effectively. So it may be challenging, but it's not traumatic. If you were untrained and rolled up on your 10-speed bike in your board shorts and all you have is a sand bucket and a garden hose, that's a traumatic event. And so in the same way, many times when we're young, we're faced with situations for which we're not adequately prepared and resourced. Give an example. A 2-year-old is given an ice cream cone and discovers the bliss, the nirvana of how good the ice cream tastes and feels in their mouth. And because there's not a huge baseline of reference, this is a peak emotional experience, and it's a blissful emotional experience. And then they lick too hard and the ice cream falls on the sidewalk. Now that's Armageddon, because they've not experienced a lot of loss. And so there's this wonderful thing. And now suddenly they're in this place of loss. And so they look around for, how do I navigate this? And based on how the environment interacts with them, gives them cues as to how it is they're supposed to navigate their trauma. Is it suck it up, deal with it? Okay, well then I learned that I don't have the ability to express myself. Is it, oh, we'll just get you another one, without any discussion? Okay, well then there's infinite supply. So that even something as simple as this can be very nuanced as far as the data that comes in to program those responses and those adaptive behaviors. And so the shadow is really things that we, for whatever reason, haven't chosen to explore. If we can remove judgments and just explore what is, and look at it not either good or bad, it just is. Oh, this is something that's present. Let's be curious about it. Let's explore it a little bit. And if we look at so many of the ancient wisdoms, you look at the Chinese yin and yang. The light is no better than the dark. Really, the desire is to dance on the S-curve between the two, between rigidity and flow, between the light and the dark, between the order and the chaos. Because anything to an extreme is not beneficial for the individual or the collective community. You look at Lakota tradition of the Heyoka, the sacred clown, and even those two things seem diametrically opposed. And so the Heyoka will dress backwards or do things that seem silly and inappropriate to encourage deeper spiritual dives and exploration. And the Heyoka in ceremony paints half their face white, half their face black. So there's another example of understanding the balance that needs to take place for us to truly experience this iteration of our consciousness. You can look at some of the Buddhist traditions that are more 3-part, which is wholeness, which is one aspect of consciousness, being comfortable with wholeness, which is this present iteration, being comfortable with nothingness, and then being comfortable with oneness. One of the great Buddhist teachers of the current age said, enlightenment is when the wave realizes it's the ocean. And so that's that wholeness piece.
I've always loved that Rumi quote, you're not a drop in the ocean, you're the ocean in a drop.
Yeah. So being able to step out of the doingness and to be able to contemplate those things. And then, if we come back at things through an internal family systems lens, with Dick Schwartz's wonderful work that we integrate into the work we do. And then there'll be those voices, the protectors that are like, stop, that's not productive. We need to be in the doingness, because those protectors try to manage expectation, and ultimately they're, in Dick's book, No Bad Parts, there's that whole premise. None of the parts are bad parts. And so if we bring that into shadow work, none of the parts are bad parts. Sometimes they're highly misunderstood.
Well, I think like shadow work and parts work are essentially one and the same. And there's so many different ways and language and approaches for people to work with this. But essentially, it's integrating fractured parts of the psyche, parts of the psyche that have been abandoned and abused and ignored and pushed to the back. And when you think about these parts of the psyche, often the parts that we're working with people are usually like very young parts. And so then when you start to see it from that perspective, you realize that you have ignored, abused, and gagged the 4-year-old in you that's been looking for safety for decades. And now you realize that you've just been abusing your inner 4-year-old. So parts work and a lot of this work is about coming forth, bringing up this part that's experiencing an emotion, even if in your day-to-day life, you might think it's ridiculous and shove it to the back burner. When you actually make some space for it to be like, okay, 4-year-old, like, what do you want? And it's like, I just need to feel like you love me and that you care about me. And then you just like have that conversation for 10 minutes. And then all of a sudden this fractured part of the psyche is now integrated. You can do some very cool work with this stuff. And I'll share a vulnerable state of mind. And then I'm curious as to like what a piece of shadow work that has been profound for you that you've gone through. And as we go through this, like feel free to also ask me questions so we can just enjoy a discussion about this. But like, for example, so I'll bring this up because I actually just recently put a piece about it out on social and a lot of people got very agitated by it. And so I find anytime that stuff rubs people in a certain way, I think it's worth talking about. And so I brought up the concept of the shadow work of the people pleaser. And people got very frustrated because they're like, well, when you're in a situation where you have to people please, like you have no choice. And my argument to that was you always have a choice. If you're choosing to people please, you are making that choice. And if you're choosing to stay in an environment that's toxic and abusive so that you can people please, you're also making that choice. And so for me, like going through my own experiences, I went through a situation where I had felt like I had been misled. And I was very frustrated and I felt very betrayed. And then when I thought about it later and I did my shadow work, which often came in those identity shift, deep reflection times where you feel like maybe it's a step backwards, but actually it's a massive leap forwards, was this realization that in that interaction, because I had been trying to make everything okay and been trying to please that person and give them everything that they needed, I realized that I had been lying. I had been dishonest. I had been misleading about what I needed. And therefore, how would that person ever be expected to respond correctly? And I had done that because I didn't want to scare them away. But what I should have done was scare them away. I would have saved a lot of time and energy for both of us. And so it was this huge realization that being authentic is one of the healthiest, safest things that you can do for everybody, even if it leads to loss. And that people pleasing is actually a form of manipulation and lying. And I found that fascinating because a lot of people pleasers tend to think that they're being hyper ethical by sacrificing themselves. So I'd love to hear anything that you want to share around that, or like one of your greatest realizations from your shadow work, and because I think this is relevant for a lot of people.
Sure. So you're touching on a lot of work that Carl Jung did. Yeah, the dynamic between what he labeled the narcissist and the empath. And that codependency that gets created because each is fulfilling an aspect of their perceived need from the other. I see it a lot with the populations that we serve. You've got special operators who are really at their core are empaths. They're the white knights. They want to go save the world. And that goes back into, if we look at the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic versus parasympathetic. So the sympathetic nervous response is fight, flight, fear, or fight, flight,
freeze, fawn,
and fornicate. There's actually 5 Fs.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah. So because when we're in that fear response, wanting to plant the seed for the continuation, that's something that the biological vehicle wants to do. And so we see that a lot in high stress environments with these higher performers. There can be hyper arousal as well, because there's there's that desire to make sure that there's some iteration that moves forward. But if we focus in, so the very first response we have is a freeze response. That's dorsal vagal response, and that's the catching of the breath. And when we're getting ready to pull a trigger, we see a phone call coming in from somebody we don't want to talk to. If we're getting ready to push a rep, kick a ball, throw a punch, we catch our breath, because then that's going to stimulate adrenal response to keep us in that more heightened sympathetic state. So out of freeze, when we go into fawn is a fear-based response. And so those who will say, no, I'm being hyper-ethical, they're really operating from a place of fear.
Mm-hmm.
And so that fear is, I am afraid of being alone. I am afraid of failure. I am afraid that if I don't capitulate to the other person, then the lack of safety will increase. And those are responses that are created very early on. But then that gets conflated with morals and values and dignity. And I can tell you, with the populations we serve, so many times the concept of service and sacrifice are conflated. Well, if it didn't cost you, then did you really serve?
Mm.
And so that idea of somehow I have to bleed for it to be worthwhile, which makes no logical sense. Leaky lifeboats have a hard time rescuing people.
That's a very good way to put it.
And those very same people, when I talk to them, I'm like, well, so did you just throw your weapon in a corner until you needed to go out on patrol, or did you clean it every time? Did you maintenance your vehicles? I got to keep the equipment top notch. Why? Because if the shit hits the fan, well, I need to know that it'll operate. I said, okay, so turn that same lens back on yourself.
Thank you.
And so that constant, that belief system that, well, if I cut off my arm and throw it to the dogs, then the whole pack won't attack me and I can get away. So that was an adaptive behavior. But for us to continue to move in that direction, we cast around to try to make sense, because when that becomes our identity, then we're going to create story around that to continue to justify it, because that's how we survived to get up to this point.
I could not agree more. And as we're talking about all this, I've just had this flash in my head a few times. There's so many different forms of vulnerability. And a lot of people will think of like donning armor and going into battle. That is incredibly vulnerable. Mm-hmm. As is stripping your armor off to being naked. Mm-hmm. And being in that kind of container with people. That is also incredibly vulnerable. And both of these have their own learnings in them. And I think when we really look at like what life is about, right? It's this idea of getting to experience all these different levels of development and all these different states, and different people are going to be in different levels of development. So now I've kind of turned to interacting with the world in the way of, every time I meet someone, I'm like, oh, okay, so what are the rules of this person's game? It's like, how does this person play their life? What are their expectations? Like, how do I meet them where they are? And I think anytime that you are facilitating anything or being a practitioner of anything, that becomes even more important. Mm-hmm. But I think that's like a very good life lesson to use with people in general.
So I'm curious about that.
Sure.
So when you say, okay, what rules do they play by? And I'm going to poke at you a little bit.
Sure.
Is that just curiosity to determine if there is overlap and place for connection, or is that part of that pleaser, the fawn response, to figure out, how do I make sure this person's comfortable? I
think it is an evolution of that way of being. Mm-hmm. Because that was the way that I grew up, like understanding the world, right? Like I was the last thing that I was thinking about. I was always thinking about everything else around me. And so that has turned into development of, instead of it being a survival state, it's a curiosity state. Okay. And I think any time that you turn anything into a game of curiosity, you're coming from a significantly different place neurologically
Sure.
than if you're trying to figure them out for your own gain, because that's like the other shadow work of the empath, right?
Right.
And I was doing this work with a client once, and it was so intriguing to ask her the questions and then have her literally verbalize it, but not realize that she was verbalizing it, right?
Yeah.
And so I was asking her, I was like, okay, well, like when you're doing this people pleasing, like what are you trying to do? And she's like, well, they have something that I need.
Right.
And that is the state that you're operating in when you're being a people pleaser. And that's the shadow work, is like seeing that thing of being like, oh, I'm actually trying to manipulate someone to get something,
Sure.
even if it's me being nice to them. And so when you're coming from a place of curiosity, it's more about wanting to like understand somebody
Mhm.
rather than like meeting them in a way that feels comfortable for them and for you,
Mhm.
but in a state that's not like you're trying to get anything out of them. And I think that's like the difference, right? Is the end goal. It's like, what's your end goal? Understanding someone or getting something?
Well, and then when we tug back on it, so is it a fear rooted program, or
Yes.
is it a love rooted program, right? So,
Yes.
you know, one of the things we talk about is, people tend to look at things as good and evil.
Yeah.
But if we stretch those lines out further, it's not good and evil. It's love and fear.
Yes.
Because at the end of that spectrum, you have, over on this side, you have fear. The child of fear is control. And then the children of control are things like greed and coveting and
Power.
and anger and craving and all of those things. Why do we have those? Because we want control. And then why do we want control? Because we have fear. On the other side, if we have love, and so all of that leads more to reaction versus response. So if we look over on the other side, we've got love, and the children of love are bliss and peace and empathy and compassion, all of those things that we view as good and virtuous. And those are the children of response versus reaction. And so if we can approach somebody with what I call ambivalent objective curiosity and loving kindness, then we're coming into it from a response perspective instead of a reaction perspective. I would offer, and this might be controversial, I would say that empaths have, their shadow is covert narcissism.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the like attracts like is just different sides of it. Two sides, you take magnets and one way they'll click together and the other way they'll repel each other. So that clicking together is because it's a different side of that very same trait. So every narcissist has the capability of being a phenomenal empath, and every empath has on their dark side that covert narcissism. So that therein is the yin and the yang within the person. And so being able to explore that, so that's the shadow work. It's like, oh, I'm operating from a base of fear. What is it that I'm afraid of? And then being able to go in and face that shadow so that there can be an understanding. Somebody who says that they're a good person without ever having explored their shadow is being less than honest with themselves or the world
Ticking
around
time
them.
bomb.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, the difference between the like developmental level of those two approaches is the initial approach that was less mature would have approached someone and been like, do they like me? How do I get them to accept me? Versus when the growth happens and the security comes in, it changes to, do I like them? Do I accept them into my life as a valuable add to my life?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the difference between those two. Whereas like the far end of the narcissist might be, what can I get out of them? Right. And so like there's like these different levels of development. And I think that security in the center is the magical place to learn how to operate.
Yeah. Because if you look at self-love versus self-sacrifice versus self-indulgence, right? So again, pulling a little bit from Hawkins' work, most of us are not taught how to have self-love.
Yes. Or that it's shameful to have self-love.
Right. And because then that gets misnomered as self-indulgence.
Right.
because that's part of the programming to conflate service and sacrifice. That, is there nobility in sacrifice? Absolutely. To the point of where you're depleting yourself and you're unable to continue to give, not so much. But again, when fear comes creeping in, either fear from those that are dictating that conflation, or fear of not being accepted within the community or society, then we've got these shadow parts that end up into adaptive behaviors.
So as we talk about all of these things, I'm so curious what you see in how the identity can actually destabilize once the nervous system realizes that it's no longer in this bracing state, and why people can feel a little wobbly, and how they can really step into finding this new identity. Because I know you have a very thoughtful process that works through those things.
Well, it goes back to some of the things we talked about before, with that default mode network and the amygdala response, and the building of identity around the performance, the doingness versus the beingness. And so many people wrap their identity around the doingness, and then when there's no longer something to do, then there's an identity crisis.
Yep.
I can tell you from my personal experience, growing up, I had a very difficult childhood and some challenges at home. I had a very abusive, chronically alcoholic father and a mother that dissociated to be able to survive. And so there was a lot left there to navigate. And I went into the military believing, okay, here's this place where I can go and make a difference, and I can save suffering, save people from suffering, and I can be the hero of my story. And everybody there has it figured out. They went there because they felt the call to honor and integrity and all of these beautiful things. And so, I initially went into the military in the 80s, and wanted to work my way into fighting the cartels, stopping the trafficking of drugs into the United States. I was Nancy Reagan, just say no, DARE program. And that was like, okay, I'm going to go fix this thing. Pablo Escobar, I'm coming for you, right? And so I went into the military seeking that structure, seeking that community, seeking that bigger than life experience. And what I found when I got there over time, I realized that everybody above me in the chain of command went looking for the same thing too. They didn't find it, and shit rolls downhill. And so I was in this alcohol-soaked Lord of the Flies experience, but at least it was a community. And I knew where I was in that community. We wore BDUs back in those days. And so in the Army, you wore your rank and your branch on your collar. You had if you had any tabs, Special Forces tab, Ranger tab, Airborne tab, that's on one side. You wore your combat patch on the other side, and you had your special schools insignias on your chest. And so you could very quickly figure out where you fit into the matrix. And it's like, okay, I see your rank, I see your branch, I see what tabs you have, I see who you went to combat with, I see what your special schools are. And even though there's an official rank structure, there's also kind of an unofficial mojo scale as well, right? Because so like a special forces tabbed infantry captain with airborne wings and maybe another couple of special schools can roll up on a supply lieutenant colonel. And I'm not saying this is right. I'm just saying that this is where I was at that time. And so I can look and say, yeah, okay, you're a transportation lieutenant colonel, I'm tip of the spear, you're support. And so that's where that ego and, and some of that identity for self-gratification and comes into play. It's like, yeah, technically you outrank me, however. And then on the flip side, if you have a command sergeant major who's enlisted, but has spent 20 plus years in the Army, and then you have a second lieutenant that's still wet behind the ears, technically the second lieutenant outranks a command sergeant major, until that second lieutenant gets his ass whipped, emotionally and situationally, by that command sergeant major who's got a lot of earned respect and rank. So, but you figure that out fairly quickly to operate in this paradigm, and there's indoctrination to come into that environment, and so there is at least a level of stability until there's not, because when you leave the military, there's no unwinding of that indoctrination. So now, what is my identity? Who am I? Because that goes back into that performance-based identity. So if I'm not an infantry officer anymore, what am I? Because even within that paradigm, we're conditioned to look up the chain of command for direction, also validation, because I've got to make sure that I'm doing well in front of my raider and my senior raider, because that ensures my upward mobility. And you're in a system, or I was in a system that, okay, regardless of what I'm doing, I've got money hitting my account twice a month. I get my leave and earnings statement. I see how much there is. So there is a level of provision to maintain that identity. And then once we're out, okay, what do I do? And I've worked with a lot of professional athletes, a lot of law enforcement, firefighters, military, and that struggle with, okay, who am I now, becomes very challenging. And so, to your point of how do we navigate that discomfort, it's going in and laying the baseline of, regardless of spiritual practice, religious upbringing, can we agree that there was some aspect of you that existed before you occupied this biological vehicle that will continue to exist after you exit? Is there some form of agreement there? Call it soul, spirit, light, love, energy, higher self, consciousness, the universe, source. If we can find that baseline without creating dogma, okay, then let's recognize that is your identity. That's who you are. You're this infinite being in whatever form you choose to view it. Okay, that's your identity. So now the things that you've done, those are beautiful things that you've done. This biological vehicle you're driving around in, that is a vehicle. Your vehicle says something about you. If you've got a Jeep with a 5-inch lift and can go up into the backwoods, cool, that says a lot about you. If you're driving a Ferrari, that says something about you, but that's not your identity. And so when we realize, okay, this is a vehicle, so then we can start deconstructing those, that sense of identity around either the biological vehicle or the experiences this biological vehicle has had, and be able, and so that's where we're starting to pull the lens back and be able to look at things and observe them versus being in the thick of them. For people that play video games, there's a difference between being in the first person shooter perspective versus the third person, where you're floating over the top of your avatar. In the same way, when we can recognize that our consciousness supersedes our physical being, and we can pull back into that third person, then that's where we can truly see things from a more complete perspective, and move towards healing of those things that have come with really holding tightly to a particular identity. And there is nothing more powerful in the human psyche than our sense of identity.
I could not agree with that more. And I think you hit a very important piece of things that people forget about, in that one of the greatest stages I feel like we must go through in almost all forms of healing that's unexpected for people is grief.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to grieve things in the past. We have to grieve a future that maybe didn't happen that we thought was going to happen. We might have to grieve other people in our life, friends that we've lost, people we don't resonate with anymore, people who are no longer on the same path as us. And it's not pleasant. And it's usually uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we have to also like grieve that old identity. Or I talk to athletes about this a lot when they'll get injured and then all of a sudden everything that their life is about is just gone.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a huge thing that nobody talks about for even just active people in general, but especially people like pro athletes, or when something like that is your entire profession. Like, that's terrifying to have that shift and change and feel like you may never get back the parts of yourself that bring you small pieces of joy. I know I even went through that when I had my injuries, as I was like, oh my gosh, I can't do any of the things that bring me joy anymore. What even brings me joy? And then I had to start figuring out other approaches to that and realizing the benefit of just a walk outside and how beautiful that can be. And I think when people are stuck in a survival state, or they're stuck in a state of depression or a state of angst or a state where they're just unhappy, it's because they can't see those things anymore. Mm-hmm. And so there is this component of grief, of working through what maybe shouldn't have happened and actually allowing yourself to feel upset about something. Mm-hmm. And then maybe looking at what you thought was going to happen and allowing yourself to be sad that it didn't go that way. Mm-hmm. And then allowing yourself to move through the disbelief and the bargaining and all of that and the depression of it. And then eventually you come to a place of acceptance. But I think helping people find out what they're even grieving as those identities shift is huge.
Yeah. That is very much a part of moving the energy, giving yourself permission to feel.
Yes.
And that goes back to, if we look at things through an IFS lens, and I wanted to circle back to that because we've, what Dick Schwartz calls the exiles, I call the wounded little ones. Yes. And when we face trauma, which is the situation for which we're not adequately prepared or resourced, then we have different aspects of the psyche that come online, mm-hmm. that are either protectors or firefighters, to use Dick's vernacular. And so they have the emotional intelligence of when they had to come online. Mm-hmm. And so you've got a firefighter who wanted to soothe the wounded little one. And so I've expanded out on Dick's work a little bit. I break firefighters into two parts, two types of firefighters, which either you have the firefighter that says, okay, I'm going to soothe the wounded little one and screw everybody else. Because I'm going to create that soothing. And again, that's the emotional intelligence of the firefighter, is when they needed to come online. The other side of those firefighters are, I'm going to please everyone else and I'm going to push the wounded little ones down even further. And sometimes we have blended parts. You've got the managers, and the managers are those that are ultimately trying to keep the system safe. That's where judgment and self-limiting belief. And so then if we bring a little bit of Shirzad Shamin's positive intelligence into the mix, because I really like how Shirzad approaches what Dick would call managers. He calls them saboteurs. And then they're also sages. And so you've got this organization. The sages are the parts that are benevolent and helping move forward in a more productive way. The saboteurs are the ones that are self-limiting, and Shirzad talks about finding connection with those. And so we have the judge, and typically the judge is the lead manager or manager firefighter blend to toggle back and forth between the vernaculars. And part of it is, okay, let's take the gavel out of the judge's hand and give the judge a pom-pom, to where it's a cheerleader instead of a judge. And the avoider, okay, well then that's more your intelligence officer. So repurposing those aspects of self, not trying to exile those parts and say, oh, I hate this part of me. No, because they're all doing the best they can with the tools they have. And their intention is good. So we just need to repurpose them with a better tool or a better set of tools. I was doing parts work with a client who had a history of binge eating, and eating what what would be called eating disorder. And we were able to get to that part that was a firefighter and connect with that part who was little. She said, all I've ever wanted to do is keep everybody safe, but the only tool I have is food. And so when I see the wounded little ones hurting, I just want to feed them. I just want to help. But if that's the only tool, then, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so being able to get in and explore, and even so we've got those wounded little ones, and when we can connect, like you were saying, the 4-year-old, we can sit down and connect and allow an unburdening, which allows a retrieval. Schwartz vernaculars there, to assimilate that part back into the psyche. What we do a lot is also we talk to those firefighters and those protectors and those managers and approach them and say, hey, it must be really challenging to be so misunderstood. And so even allowing those aspects to be seen and be approached with curiosity and loving kindness. So we repatriate even the protectors and bring those from kind of the front line of defense into the collective.
I'm so glad that you explained a bit about like how parts work, or IFS, or however, what language you're using to describe it, works for people, because it's so true. And like, as you're talking about that, I was just thinking about some of the most interesting repurposing roles I've seen people do. And I have had like parts that were all about guilt turn into quality control experts. And I've had parts that were dark and dangerous and angry turn into border and boundary officers.
Right.
And so it's like there's so many ways that you can repurpose these parts, but you have to look at them and talk to them.
Right.
And that's the shadow work that everyone's avoiding.
That's the shadow work is, okay, this thing's scary because it's, it's a protector.
It makes me feel shameful.
Yeah. But when you can get in and explore that and realize that part, the intent was so pure, which was preservation of self and the organization, and then bring some more tools in and say, okay, so firefighter that pushes everybody, pushes the little ones down to please everybody else. Okay, so we recognize your desire for community. That's a beautiful aspect. But let's also look at it in a way where it's beneficial in both directions.
I had a mentor call those firefighters, this is actually from like Bill Plotkin's work in the book Wild Mind, but call them the loyal soldiers. And then that mentor was talking about his personal experience with it. And he said that his loyal soldiers showed up as like Secret Service agents. And then he was talking to them in his mind, right? And noticed they had all these like scars and wounds. And he asked them about them. And they said, well, sir, we'd take a bullet any day for you. And then you realize that it's this part of you that's taken all the hits and it's taken all the bullets. And then you start to have this love for it instead of this hatred. Right.
With that belief that the ends justify the means. And so maybe then those parts that work in what we call the shadow may not be aligned with other parts that are in judgment. And so we have those internal conflicts. So when we can find resolution or agreement or respect, then things don't feel so bifurcated or siloed inside. One of the things that we do in our parts work is have people visualize a safe place, and a place that's safe for all of the parts, even the parts that are quote annoying or immature. And so like when I work with folks in the C-suite, it might be a boardroom, but there's the boardroom where parts are meeting, but then there's also a break room off to the side where the protectors can go get a cup of coffee or and for the little ones, that don't want to be seen. Okay, there's a bouncy house around the corner and there's soft serve ice cream and their thing, because they can build this in their mind. And then we actually encourage them to use AI to build out a picture of this whole this whole layout, so that all the parts feel welcome. And because we're building it in our mind, it can be whatever we want.
Well, and there's this component that all of these similar techniques use when they're doing this stuff, where there's like a spatial component inside of your mind. So it's like you really are using all of your senses. And often when I'm helping people find that place, I'll be like, oh, tell me what it looks like. Tell me about it.
Yeah.
What does it smell like? And then all of a sudden you create this internal reality that's just as real as anything external. And the brain doesn't know the difference between imagination and the real world. So this is where you start to have a lot of the physiological changes, and you can help someone enter a state of safety when they're just sitting with their eyes closed, but it's because of what you're helping them navigate internally.
Right. Right. I saw a study where there was a women's college basketball team that was broken into 3 groups. The first group did not have extra practice for free throws. The group number 2 had an extra half an hour a day for free throws. And then the third group didn't touch the ball extra. They just visualized shooting free throws, vivid visualization for 30 minutes as opposed to actually touching the ball. And what they found was group A, their free throws dropped by about 15%. And that might have the numbers off by a point or two. The second group that was shooting improved by about 22%. And the third group that was vividly visualizing improved by 20%. So a 90% increase just by vivid visualization without actually deploying the body to go through the reps.
Oh, they've done other ones where they've shown piano players where some of them practice the piece and some of them visualize practicing the piece, and they have the same changes in gray matter in the brain. It's really, really cool.
Yeah.
So when people go through these processes, and I know in your work you use a variety of different tools to help people wherever they're at on their journey. But what do you see it looks like for people when, first off, they're trying to do integration instead of just embodying it? And then what that integration actually looks like in day-to-day behavior when it's done healthily?
So I'll swim upstream from this a little bit because one of the tools that we utilize that's incredibly effective is the use of entheogenic medicines. Some would call psychedelics. I prefer the name entheogens, which is connecting to God within. And so in whatever form that looks like for the individual, what we have found. So when we go back to previously in our conversation where we were talking about the bliss, the peak emotional experience of bliss with the ice cream cone, and then the trauma of the loss of the wonderful thing, and all of those emotions that come. We approach things that when we have moments of peak emotional experience, we've got pliability in the psyche, and if we, to use a metaphor, if we look at the psyche like a piece of metal, and peak emotional experiences, whether bliss or trauma, will warm up the metal to allow it to be formed, whether we pick up the tools and form it or whether environmental tools are forming it. So that starts molding our psyche. And when we're little, because we don't have the base of experience, most everything is a peak emotional experience, which is why we're so pliable when we're young. And so we've got the ice cream cone incident, and then moving forward, we've got more life experience. I'm in 8th grade, and the cute girl in math class passes me a note that says, "Hey, you're cute." And so that's a bliss peak emotional experience. And so then I look around for resourcing to help me maintain that state. And so I discover showering once a day instead of once a week. And I discover brute body spray, because I want to, I'm looking, okay, what tools do I have where I can keep this going? And so I'm pliable. And so now patterns are going to shift. And then 2 weeks later, she breaks up with me and I start wearing black and I listen to emo music because, okay, I look around, okay, what are my friends doing when they're navigating, trauma. And so I'm going to pull those things from the environment and that continues in life. And so when we get, so I'll take you fast forward into the military, from my experience, you go through I went through a significant trauma. So I look around, okay, mental wellness in the military, that's cheese and a rat trap. I lose my upward mobility. I lose my cool points. I lose whatever it is we want to say. So there's a very definite fear of loss there. So I'm not going to reach for that. I'm going to, what else is on the tool bench? Alcohol. That's very accepted. And so, okay, I'm going to use that as a self-soothing tool to help me navigate this peak emotional experience. And so then when the metal cools, now that form is locked in, it's solid. And so I'm moving forward and that tool becomes more and more prevalent. Even so, until I hit another peak emotional experience, I'm not going to change out that tool for another tool until there's a diagnosis or a DUI or divorce papers or whatever the case might be, because this is my adaptive behavior that I've assimilated. But then one of those things happens, I'm in a peak emotional experience, the metal's now malleable, so now I can form it into something else. And so there might be another tool that gets brought in, whether it's CrossFit or veganism or
well, this is so relevant for like addiction of any kind, right? Because often people will lose one addiction and pick the next thing, but it's like that's not the pattern that's healed. It's about having the awareness of it,
right? And so we train in, okay, that's a better tool, but maybe not the optimal tool, because we've still got to get down and address why are we picking up that particular tool to begin with? Is it coming from a place of self-love, or is it coming from a place of fear and unresolved feelings? And so bringing that back to Hawkins, Hawkins talked about, our society doesn't allow us to feel. And so we're either we're in self-indulgence, self-sacrifice. Rarely are we in self-love. And we tell people when you set a healthy boundary is the place where you get to love yourself and the other person equally. And with each interaction, that boundary might be in a different place. For some people, that boundary might be right here next to your heart. For others, it might be 4 kilometers down the road and you wave at them twice a year. You can still love them, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have to set yourself on fire to keep them warm. And we also don't need to throw kerosene in a match on other people to keep us warm either. Because if we're scorching our support system, then pretty soon we don't have a support system. So ultimately, it doesn't benefit us to okay, what can I get from you, and be in a consumer perspective, and what Hawkins calls those survival energy states, right? We can. So we'll bring some Ram Dass in here. Ram Dass said the very best thing you can do for the people you love is to become the very best version of yourself you can be.
And he also said, if you think you're enlightened, go hang out with your family.
Yeah. But and that goes back to what you were talking about in some of your circumstance with, if I'm not showing up genuinely for the other person, how can I reasonably expect them to connect with me if they're not getting a version of myself, true version of myself?
How could you ever consider it a real relationship if you've only lied about yourself?
Right.
Love this conversation. You're one of those people I could talk to forever. As we come to a little bit of a close, I'd love to kind of wrap these up with kind of one last idea around identity. So the experiences that you were just talking about, I'm curious what you have found they tend to reveal about identity, Because when our nervous system no longer needs the person that we were, who gets to emerge in their place?
So just like we were talking, those facades that we put forward to engage, when those get to pull away, then true self gets to emerge. And for many, if we've never had that connection with true self, we don't even know what that looks like. And so then that goes into, oh, this is scary. Well, what if the people around me don't like that person? Mm-hmm. Well, you can't sustain a facade. You can until you can't. And then ultimately, if the people that are around, and in most cases, we kick the tripwire. In most cases, the people that are around you, if what you've been presenting varies greatly from your true self, the majority of those folks aren't going to stick around because you're not on the same frequency.
You've surrounded yourself with people who don't actually care about you because they don't actually know you.
Right. And so again, that goes back to the empath being upset that, well, nobody understands me. Well, because you haven't given them the opportunity to understand you, because you haven't truly shown them who you are.
You've given no vulnerability.
Right. So although empaths self-identify as the most vulnerable, in many cases, they're some of the strongest defenses.
Self-sacrifice and vulnerability are not the same thing.
Correct.
Beautiful. So beautifully stated. And I guess if we were to leave listeners with something, what would you want someone who's in that kind of in-between space to know?
Well, if I can circle back
Sure.
to a previous thread where we were talking about the metal of the psyche,
sure,
and how it gets molded, and there need be peak emotional experiences to allow those opportunities for pliability. There are many different approaches to creating those peak emotional experiences. Taking people out and challenging their fear responses, going through ropes courses, or new behavior patterns that create a real sense of a peak emotional experience. A lot of the work we do uses those entheogenic medicines, because if we look at that metaphor, the plant medicines end up being like a furnace, to where you can take the metal of the psyche, put them into the furnace and heat them up.
Totally.
You can cold forge a piece of metal and get it to change shape without a doubt. It takes time, it takes dedication, it's loud. To follow that metaphor, there's a lot of effort that needs to go into cold forging. Or the metal can be put into a furnace, heated up white hot. And so then the hammer strokes end up achieving a lot more than a cold forging technique would. In this work, what we've seen is people will put the metal into the furnace, bring it out, it's glowing white hot. It's like, look, this thing can cut through anything, and it's wonderful and it's great. But then when the metal cools off, you've still got the same form of the tool that you started with. And then sometimes it can be even worse, because you've taken the temper or the things that came from the cold forging. And so and this ties back to your question about integration, because when we go through that peak emotional experience and we're in those moments of pliability, that's when we can really bring in some positive conditioning tools to help reform the metal from a survival tool into a thrive tool. So the integration is critical. Just like taking a piece of metal and forming it into something new, it requires it to be hammered. In the same way, the integration, the plant medicines that we utilize are simply catalysts. They heat things up, but that's not the work. The work comes with the forge, the anvil and the hammer to forge it into the optimal tool. And recognizing it's okay to repurpose a tool, the tool of our psyche, if we want to view it through that metaphor.
I think that was beautifully stated. And that integration is by far the most important part of anything. And it's like, whether you are reaching this peak emotional state through a very sober wilderness quest or a psychedelic facilitation container with somebody, or through going to a retreat or a deep meditation retreat, or a life-changing intense experience like travel or Burning Man or something that's just breaking your pattern, the integration is just as important across all of them, because I'm so glad that we talked about it in the way that you did, because everything that we've talked about today, this path applies to everybody. It doesn't really matter what tool you're using to create a shift in state. This is about what to do with the shift in state and understanding how to really utilize it later in your life. And I know a lot of people, when we ask them about like their identity or who are they, and maybe this can just be how we wrap up, is we can share a little bit of like what we've discovered about like our truest essence of self. So it's like, we often describe ourselves through our job or through our work or through our interests or our hobbies or whatever. But I recently, after working straight for about a decade, finally took myself on a vacation and gave myself a few weeks to just unwind. And it took me a few weeks to get there. The whole first week was like my shadow work. The second week was me remembering that I like nature. I was like, oh, right. I'm just that girl that loves to observe nature and animals and like watch people in the street and hear their story about their travel and laugh and like play soccer with that random kid that passed by and enjoy seeing what people have made and what they've cultivated in the world, and like getting to see the piece of these animals and just watching them in their natural environment. I forgot about that part of myself. That's like that little kid part of yourself of like, what did you like to do when you were at the creek? And like, these are the pieces that we can start to remember of like, who am I outside of all the identities that society labels me with? And so I guess, yeah, if there's any last bits that you want to share with people, I'd love to hear your thought.
To that point, in any time there is a peak emotional experience, moving in with somebody, getting married, new job, any transition, those are opportunities to bring some of that integration work in to determine what's my optimal state and how do I backwards plan from that optimal state from here, because now I'm in a neuroplastic period and in a period of pliability. And then the other thing is, so many of the wisdom cultures, when you would go to the medicine keeper because you were sick, one of the first things asked was, when's the last time you laughed? When's the last time you danced? When's the last time you sang?
Yep.
A bird doesn't sing worried about what other birds will think. A bird sings because it has a song to sing. And so we lose track of that sometimes as humans, getting caught in the doingness instead of exploring the beingness.
I think that's a perfect place to wrap everything up. Just exploring the beingness over the doingness. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this today, Dr. Lance. It was such a pleasure.
It was a pleasure for me as well. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for being here and reclaiming your health sovereignty. If you feel ready for deeper guidance and reconnecting to your inner intelligence and finally not going the journey alone, I created the Wellness Evolution community for that exact purpose, for you. It is a place rooted in education, foundational physiology, and community support where you can learn to trust your body again. Visit www.wellnessevolutioncommunity.com for a free quiz to find out where your body is at in your healing stages.